afternoon. Hello and welcome to another talk in the archaeology strand of this year's Festival of Ideas. New discoveries in archaeology, and they're not necessarily always based on new sites, new finds and objects and that sort of a thing. Instead, we often find ourselves asking new questions from old excavations or old material that's been curated in museums and other collections from often many years ago. Sometimes asking questions that a few years previously would have seemed completely unanswerable. Over the last few years, an international team has been doing just that, reinvestigating the famous sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum, that could hardly be two more famous sites, asking new questions, not so much about the towns, but about the people that lived and died in those two very famous places. This afternoon, we are to be brought up to date on some of that research, and we welcome three people, Professor Oliver Craig and Silvia Soncin of the University of York, both work in the area of the application of scientific methods in archaeology. Silvia just completing a PhD, all basically running that side of the Department of Archaeology's activities. And Tim Thompson from Teesside University, who's Professor of Applied Biological Anthropology and works particularly on the borders between archaeology and forensic science, obviously very appropriate in this case. Their title today is the rather exciting Life and Death in the Shadow of Vesuvius. And the way we're going to take this is first a contribution from Silvia. She'll then hand over to Tim, who will then hand over to all three for a question and answer session. And you can participate in that by putting questions and questions, at least, maybe some answers, certainly questions, using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado from me, that's more than enough, I'll hand over to Silvia Soncin to start us off with the life and death in the shadow of Vesuvius.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Silvia Soncin, and I'm going to focus for the first half of this talk on what really looked like to live at the shadow of Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century AD. And in particular, I'm going to focus on what the people that were living at Herculaneum at the moment of the eruption were eating. So although Terry has already introduced myself, I wanted to start by telling you a bit more of what I do and of what I did during my PhD. So I've been working in this beautiful building where BioArch is located, which is a facility of the Department of Archaeology of the University of York. And basically what we do at BioArch is we apply cutting-edge techniques in chemistry and biology to investigate social dynamics of past human populations, such as, for example, migratory patterns or ancient dietary practices in my case. And it is thanks to my PhD that I had a chance to study probably one of the most famous human assemblage in archaeology, which is that of AD 79 Herculaneum. So let's get started with the real talk now. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire had reached its greatest territorial expanse and population density. It has been estimated that at that time, 60 million of people were living scattered around this geographical area, and 1 million only were living in the city of Rome. This population growth was unprecedented in human history, so the state had to put in place a complex system of production and distribution in order to sustain this number of people. We know, for example, from the ancient sources, that every month, 33 kilograms of free wheat were distributed from the provinces in each harbor to the empire to each male citizens. So this free wheat was coming from the provinces of Sicily and Sardinia first, and then from North Africa and Egypt. So thanks to data like this one, some historians of the ancient economy have estimated that in terms of calorie, the majority of the diet of these people was composed of cereals, and precisely 70%. This was followed by vegetables and fruits, by terrestrial animal products, and also by marine fish, but only in minimal part. However, when we look again at this huge territory, it's really difficult to believe that everyone who was living here was eating the same stuff. So there's so much that still has to be discovered about the Roman diet. For example, if there was any difference between groups. So, for example, if women were eating differently than men, or if the elders were eating again differently than the youngest. So, moving on to Herculaneum, the ancient Roman town of Herculaneum was located in a particularly fortunate context of the Roman Empire, which is the Bay of Naples. At that time, this area was experiencing a rapid economic growth. The harbor of Puteoli was probably it was definitely one of the most important harbor for the Roman trade, and it was perhaps the most important. So all that freeway that I was telling you about, together with other goods, was coming here before being shipped with smaller boats to other harbors, such as the one of Rome, for example. And then the land around Mount Vesuvius was particularly fertile, and it was used for the large-scale production of olive oil and wine. And then, of course, there was the sea. So it must have been easy for these people to access marine resources. And some historians expect that a great part of the population was actually involved in fishing-related activities. However, in AD 79, Mount Vesuvius erupted, and this, of course, arrested the development of at least part of this area, Herculaneum and Pompeii, for sure. But I will let Tim Thompson tell you more about this later. So this is the archaeological site of Herculaneum as it looks today if you look at it from the ticket office, with Mount Vesuvius standing at its back. Until the 80s of the last century, archaeologists believed that the town of Herculaneum was completely evacuated before the eruption. And this is because during previous excavations, only very few human remains were discovered around the town. However, in 1982, the archaeologists started excavating this area here, which is located under the Subumba Baths and the sacred area here. And this area corresponds to the ancient seashore. The archaeologists here found an incredible amount of skeletons, more than 300 skeletons, and these people were probably getting ready to leave the city by sea, while others were hiding themselves under these vaulted chambers that you see here that were probably used for the recovery of the boats during the winter months. So the discovery of the bodies had an incredible mediatic resonance at that time. It was indeed an exceptionally rare scene of human tragedy that was revealed from the past, which was forever impressed in the last movements and phases of these people. But most importantly, from an archaeological point of view, this population represents an incredible opportunity to investigate group dynamics that is usually really difficult to investigate from people that are recovered from cemeteries. And I'm telling you, I will try to explain you why. So if you think about it, people that are buried in cemeteries were most likely ill before they died. And this might have made them change their everyday life and therefore their diets as well. And of course, if we use the skeletons to investigate diet, the diet might actually be biased in some way by the illness. Similarly, another important bias of cemeterial populations is that cemeteries are usually used over a large period of time, usually at least 100 years. And in that period, the access to resources might have changed. So, for example, the trade routes might have changed, there might have been climatic changes, or the geography might have changed a bit. And therefore, if we then start comparing the diet of these people, we might be biased. But this is not the case of Herculaneum, which can be considered a real living population. These people were not going to die if it wasn't for the AD 79 eruption. So luckily for us, we can learn a lot from skeletal materials, and in particularly there's a kind of analysis. There's a type of analysis that is the one that I've applied during my PhD, which is called carbon and nitrogen stable isotope analysis, and it's applied on a protein can be extracted from the bones of these people. So in our bones and in the bones of these people, such as this one here that I'm going to present you now, is F9A, a male adult individuals that was recovered from under the fornicium, from under those vaulted chambers that I showed you before. This protein, once is extracted from the bones, really looks like candy floss, as you can see here. But if we look at it a bit more carefully, we will see that it has a structure that pretty much looks like this one here. So it has all these segments that are actually the amino acids that compose the collagen. And then what we do is we measure the isotopic content of the carbon and nitrogen atoms elements in the collagen. So isotopes, really briefly, are atoms of the same elements that only differ by their mass. Therefore, each element will have, in our case, carbon and nitrogen, will have an isotope which is heavier and an isotope which is lighter. But why do we want to know about the relative concentrations of these isotopes, which are expressed with this notation here, which is the delta notation? Because the values of the collagen are actually linked to the values of the molecules that compose the foodstuff that this person here has once eaten. And our body uses these atoms to build up all the tissues that we need to survive, collagen included. So this is usually what we call metabolism, which is really a very complex system of chemical reactions. So if we then plot in a graph like this, the delta 13C and the delta 15N values of our humans and of those of the foodstuff that were available for that person, so these are foodstuffs that we have collected from the territories of the eruption, we can start trying interpreting these values. And if you look at it, you can see that it's plotting somewhere, this individual is plotting somewhere between terrestrial sources, such as cereals, terrestrial products, animal products, but even legumes. But probably there's also a certain degree of a marine contribution. If we now take another individual, such as this woman, F9B, we can start seeing some differences. So can you see that this individual here is plotting a bit more closer to the terrestrial resources compared to F9A? So probably this individual is getting less marine proteins than F9A is. However, there's much more that we can learn about diet of these individuals. But to do so, we need to go back to that black box, which was representing the metabolism in the previous slide, and we need to open it. And this is really what I did for my PhD. So once that box is opened, we will see that there's thousands of chemical reactions that might seem very complicated, and they probably are. But basically, what I want to tell you with this slide is that if we look again at the structure of the collagen that I showed you before, I don't know if you remember, but I was telling you about all these segments, which are the amino acids. In collagen, there are around 20 different amino acids, and each of these amino acids is synthesized by our body in different ways. There are some amino acids that cannot even be synthesized by our body. So our body is not able to make these amino acids by itself. And so he has to get it from the proteins in diet. So for example, we have phenylalanine here that skips all the reaction because our body cannot make it. It skips all the reaction. And when the body sees it, it keeps it and it uses to make the collagen among the other proteins. So this amino acid will tell us something about those food items that are very rich in proteins, such as marine fish. On the contrary, other amino acids are synthesized using different macronutrients. So, for example, alanine here will tell us something about the contribution of carbohydrates and therefore of all those food items that are very rich in carbohydrates, such as cereals and cereal products. So then what I did with my PhD is I've collected all these values that I got from each amino acid, and I have processed it using some statistical tools. And then I was able to look at the results in quantitative terms, and in particular, I was looking at the calories, at the calorific intake from different sources. So we can see here cereals, legumes, animal products, and fish. And what we can see is that both individuals are definitely getting the majority of their proteins, calories from cereals and cereal products. But then we can see differences that we weren't seeing before using the previous graph. For example, we can see that F9A is getting much more animal products than F9B is, while at the same time, F9B is getting much more marine fish than F9A is, which, if you think about the previous graph, was completely unexpected. So this is really just to show you that there's so much more that we can learn about not only the population from Herculaneum and the Bay of Naples, which is of course an exceptional case study, but also we can start learning much more about the Roman diet more in general, and we can start reflecting on the differences that we are seeing. And so, for example, why is this man eating much more animal products? But also, why is this woman here eating much more fish than he is? And also, if you remember the beginning of my presentation, I was telling you that cereals, according to the historians of the ancient economy, was contributed to around 70%. But for these individuals and for others, this was actually a bit lower. So this picture about the Roman diet is probably not so homogeneous as we previously told. And with this, I would like to thank you all for listening. I would like to thank my supervisor, Oliver Craig, who is in the panel today, but also Andrea Colonise, of course, all the institutions, and of course, the Festival of Ideas. And I'll hand it over to Tim.
Super. So I'm going to carry on this theme about trying to explore and understand a bit more about the people who lived at Herculaneum, but I'm going to focus on the death part of it and really kind of introduce to you a little bit about the sorts of information, the sorts of history that we can tell about people from their skeletal remains themselves. Now, as Silvia has already kind of pointed out in her talk, we can understand a lot about people's diets from their skeletal remains, but actually we can tell all sorts of information about you from your bones. We can have we can detect your biological sex. We can think about age at death. We can talk a bit about any diseases or illnesses that you've had, perhaps even any kind of habitual activities that you were doing as well. And as we really start to understand that that relationship between how you live your life and how that is manifest in your skeleton, we're really starting to open up interesting, exciting new questions about understanding the lives and the deaths of people in the past. But the problem what we have with this particular context, and this is the sort of area that I spend a lot of my time doing my research on, is that when we think about burnt bodies and we think about burnt skeletons, trying to get that information about the person's demography, trying to get that information about diet or sex or age is actually really challenging. And the reason it's so difficult is because of the significant changes that the skeleton goes through after you die. So what we're going to do in my talk here is we're just going to touch upon some of those key changes to the skeleton and help us understand why that is problematic for us when we're trying to understand something about these people, and then look at how we have worked around that to understand something about those who died following the Vesuvius eruption. Now, just the first thing just to bear in mind and remember is actually we get burnt remains from a whole host of different contexts. So we're talking about archaeological contexts here, but we could be thinking about modern forensic contexts, such as mass fatality incidents. We might be thinking of kind of, murders or accidental deaths, but also we need to think a bit about funerary customs as well, in terms of how we treat the dead. If we think about modern crematoria that we might be using in the UK, but also if we think a bit about how Again, you may have seen some of the images from India recently, just in terms of how they are trying to manage and cope with the vast numbers of individuals who are dying as a result of COVID. So actually, when we talk about the bone, this isn't a very small niche area of archaeology or forensic science. In fact, this is a significant area where we are experiencing quite a large number of human remains. And just to give you one very quick example of that scale, when we think about archaeological funerary contexts, there's something like 20,000 unanalyzed cremation deposits from just this country alone. So this is a significant area. Now, something else that we also have to appreciate, because here I am saying this is a really important area, and actually not a huge amount of work has been done on this. We're still developing our methods and our approaches now. And really one of the things that's allowed us to do this particular study that I'm going to talk about is that over the last 5 to 10 years, we've developed new analytical methods of analyzing burnt bone. And part of the reason that we have been so slow to embrace the study of these human remains is because there's been this view that has perpetuated for many, many years. And I use this example because it's a really good example of that, that you just can't tell anything from burnt bone, and still people think now that, when you burn a body, that's it, it's gone, it totally disappears. And that's not true at all. And even if we think about a modern crematoria, for example, even when we burn bodies in there, it does not destroy the skeleton in the way that we think it does. So actually, this idea that we can't get any information out of burnt bone is not true, it's nonsense, and we can get all the same information out of a burnt body that we can from an unburnt body. It's just a little bit harder, perhaps a bit slower, and we need some new methods to do that. So what happens then to the body when it burns? Well, actually, it goes through a huge range of changes and transformations. And here we've just got an example of the 4 key stages that body and that skeleton will go through as it's burnt. We can see in dehydration that the water is lost from the skeleton. When we think about decomposition, that's when all the organic matter is lost. We have to remember that the skeleton is a composite material. It's both the hard inorganic material like the calcium and the phosphates, but it's also organic material as well, like collagen. Then we get into the inversion stage, and this is where the chemistry of the bone starts to kind of change as a consequence of the heating. And then we get to the fusion stage. And for me, that fusion stage, that last stage, is the most interesting because that's when the most change happens. And what we see there is that the bone, which is really a complex crystal structure, it's almost like it starts to melt, and all the crystals start to fuse together. So we go from small crystals to very big crystals. The spaces, the gaps in between those crystals, including the pores that we see in bone, which we'll see in a minute, start to disappear because that inorganic material, you can imagine it as if it's becoming a bit fluid. It's not, but you can imagine it that way. And we can see the temperature ranges that we go through here. And again, just as a bit of context, when we think about an average house fire, that's about 700 degrees Celsius there. So here are just some examples of some of the sorts of changes that we might be seeing in burnt bone. And here we've got 4 images from the very surface of the bone, and we've used a very powerful microscope in order to look at that. And we can see the different temperatures of burning that we might be experiencing. And hopefully what you can see is that there is a change in the nature of the surface of the bone. Those pores, if we have a look at the difference between 100 degrees and 700 degrees, for example, the pores are disappearing because they're being filled in during that fusion phase. Again, if we have a look at that 900 degrees, the surface of the bone has been described as being like a lunar landscape because it becomes active and changes as that heating occurs. And these changes that we're seeing here then cause other sorts of changes as well. So we might see changes in color of the bone as well, changes in the strength of the bone. And that's evidence here from these examples. So here we've got 2 bones that have been, burned, and we can see 2 sorts of changes here. We can see that one bone has been bent, and that warping that we see is not common in burnt bone, but we do see that. And that's problematic if, for example, we want to look at the sex or age of an individual or the stature of an individual, because we do that by simply measuring the length of bones. And when it starts to warp, we start to get error in that. There's some interesting debate as to what causes the warping. Some people think that it's the expansion of the air inside the bone, but I don't believe that at all, because actually the bone is porous, the air would escape. I think what's more likely is either it's to do with the organic material changing and contracting due to the heat, or it's the bone when it gets to that fusion stage and it starts to become a little bit malleable as that crystal structure starts to fuse, and then if you have some weight put on it, it starts to bend. We can also see some examples of fractures as well. So bone becomes very friable and it starts to fall apart when it's burned as well. Particularly in archaeological contexts where we might also expect an element of disruption to the bone during that funerary process. For example, if it's on a pyre and the pyre collapses, or afterwards when you're trying to collect the bone remains to put in some sort of commemorative object as you go. But even that is not as straightforward, because when we think about fracturing, we see two different types of fracturing. So the fractures that you can see on my example here are lovely U-shaped thumbnail fractures, and we get that when the soft tissues on the bone is heated as well, and those muscles contract and they move along the kind of axis, the long shaft of the bone, and they cause these U-shaped fractures. If a bone is burnt and there's no soft tissue present, then actually we don't see these U-shaped fractures. What we see are a linear grid-like pattern of fractures. And that's quite useful as a rule of thumb in the forensic context when we're trying to distinguish whether or not a body has been burnt, so at the time of death or sometime later. Now, what's this graph telling us? Well, this is all, everything that I've spoken about so far is problematic. When we are trying to study bone that's been burnt, any sort of change to the skeleton is going to introduce error into our analysis. So what we try and do, and certainly some of the research that I've done and with colleagues that are speaking today, is that we have tried to understand the nature of that change and then use our understanding of that change to be able to then interpret that kind of context of death that we are studying. Now, what we have here is a graph which is focusing on something that we've called the crystallinity index. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about that. You can always ask in the Q&A if you want. But in essence, what that measure does is it allows us to analyze the crystal structure of the bone. So I've already said a few times that the crystal structure changes when bone is burnt, but it changes in a way that we know and that we understand. And so what the crystallinity index does is it allows us then to look at how much that crystal structure has changed and associate that with a temperature or an intensity of burning. Now, we've used that quite a bit. So here are two examples. In the graph here, this is from some work that we've done along Hadrian's Wall, where we've analyzed Roman military cremations. And again, what we've been able to do by looking at the change in this crystal structure and the crystallinity index is say that although the individuals that have been cremated along a number of military sites along Hadrian's Wall, along the north of the country, have they're from different parts of the world and from different backgrounds, the manner in which they were cremated was all the same. So there was a standardized military cremation practice that ran along those forts, and we could figure that out and detect that from looking at this crystal change. With the other example that we have here, where we've got our color-coded skeleton, what we were able to do here, this is from a site in Sardinia, a cave site in Sardinia. We were able to analyze multiple parts of an individual and reconstruct the position that he was on the pyre itself from very subtle changes in that crystal structure. And we can see that he was in a crouched position on his side on the pyre. So what I'm hoping that I'm doing then is convincing you that by analyzing the crystal structure, that is bypassing some of those other problems that we're seeing in terms of heat-induced changes and allowing us then to detect information about that context of death. And so that brings us up to the work that we did here at Herculaneum. This is a very similar image to the one that Silvia presented, just from a slightly different angle, and you can see the boathouses here. Now, what we did in our study is that we analyzed some of the individuals from inside those stone areas in there. When the excavations occurred, actually there were, as Silvia said, a huge number of individuals were recovered. Some of those individuals were recovered in these little boathouses, but some were recovered on the beach. And analysis of that demographic is in and of itself very interesting, because it suggests that most of those individuals who are on the beach were men and adults and perhaps teenagers, but most of those that were in the boathouses were actually women and children. So as Silvia was saying, this kind of catastrophic sample allows us to get a little bit of an understanding about how people lived their lives and how they responded to such events as this. And it gives the impression perhaps that as people were rushed out of the town, because you have to appreciate that people at Herculaneum had more time to try and escape than the people of Pompeii. They got to the beach. Perhaps we can imagine that the men were trying to pull out the boats onto the beach to try and escape, and then women and children were sheltering inside the boathouses. What we have here are graphics representing some of those boathouses, the inside structures, and each black dot represents an individual. And what we did was we looked at the crystal structure of these individuals, and we looked at the collagen within these individuals as well. And the reason that we did that was because we were interested in understanding how these people died, but we were also interested in confronting a hypothesis that when Vesuvius erupted and the pyroclastic flow shot down the mountainside, that when it hit these individuals, their soft tissues instantly vaporized. And that had been a long-standing theory, that once that heat hit, the soft tissues vaporized and all that was left were the skeletons that we saw in Silvia's presentation. What our analysis of the crystalline structure here and also of the collagen here suggested is that was not the case. Actually, what happened with these individuals here was that they got trapped in the boathouses from the debris and the pyroclastic flow as it's coming down, and then rather they suffocated and baked inside these stone structures as opposed to being burnt outside. And I can talk perhaps a bit more detail if you're interested in the Q&A about the minutiae of how we kind of resulted in that. But I think for me that's a very poignant piece of information, and also particularly when we bear in mind that each of these dots is a person, and I think where we start seeing dots very close together, that suggests that kind of sheltering together as they were trying to avoid the inevitable. But this debate about how the individuals died is still ongoing, and this is kind of my final slide that I want to end us on, because this isn't the end of the story for the studying of those who died at Herculaneum. There's arguments that brain tissue has been recovered from some of those individuals that have died, has been vitrified, turned into a glass and so forth, but we've done some subsequent work on that and we don't necessarily believe that that is the case. So that debate about what's happened, how these individuals died, is still ongoing and is a really exciting aspect of kind of archaeological science. And I think the point that I want to end on now as we move into the Q&A is that, again, studying these remains and trying to understand how these individuals have died, again, is interesting, but not only does it tell us something about that kind of context of death and how these people lived their lives, but for me in the forensic context, it's allowing us then to understand how people might respond and how we might respond to volcanic eruptions. And again, there have been lots of those in the press over the past few months and couple of years as well. So I think Silvia, Ollie and Terry, I will end there, and it's probably time for some questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim. That's taken us into some really unexpected and fascinating areas. We have now question and answer time, and as I said earlier, if you'd like to put questions onto the Q&A button, I see we have a couple of questions already. Rather delightfully, the first one, I must say, is almost exactly the question that I had scribbled down as a backup, just in case. Catherine Thorne asks, firstly, many thanks for a fascinating talk. A question for Sonia. I think that should be Silvia, but let's get it go. There you go. Are there any other differences between F9A and F9B apart from their sex? I'm intrigued to see that F9B was getting far more calories from legumes than F9A was. But by contrast, he was getting far more calories from meat than she was. So do we have an answer to this one? Silvia, can you pick this one up?
Yes,
yep.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so of course, those are just two of the individuals that we have analyzed, but there's actually more. It's just that and they actually represent an exceptional case, because we can see that, so for example, apart from the legumes, because of course that's all in relative terms. So yeah, the legumes are higher for the woman that I show you, but also other sources are higher, such as the marine fish. And this is opposite actually to the general trend that we are seeing. I didn't show all the results, because the results are currently under review in a scientific journal. I have to say, this is something we are still reflecting on, and we are constantly in contact with some historians to try and interpret these results. It might be related to their occupations. So there are other evidence from the town of Herculaneum, such as the album of names, which I don't know if you haven't heard about it, but it's a list of names and of citizens that had the right to vote in the town. And from that album of names, we know that many of these people were freedmen, liberti, and that they were most likely involved in economic activities. And as I was telling you before, most of at least some of these individuals were probably involved in fishing-related activities. So perhaps that woman, I know that you asked about the legumes. I don't know why I'm talking about the marine fish now. I got lost in the marine fish bit. But so yeah, but I'm gonna stop with the marine fish, and then I'll talk about the legumes. It might be that she was as well involved in marine fishing activity, in fishing activities, and we know that women were involved in fishing activities because it's known from the ancient sources, such as for making nets. As for the legumes, that might be more social. So we might see some differences in the way men and women were accessing resources, and that might be related to the dynamics of inequality, for example. But we really need to take this really carefully, and we are still discussing about that. That's probably why I was focusing on the marine fish rather than the legumes, because it's easier to answer to that one. I hope that answer anyway.
Thank you, Silvia. Actually, I just wonder, and I'll throw this open to all three of you, really, whether we talk about legumes, what sort of things are we talking about there in this period and this part of the world? What sort of legumes, what sort of beans and the like? Do we know? Do we have any detail?
Yeah, we do. There's a lot of different species of the legumes group. There were peas, there were chickpeas, there were, of course, broad beans, which were probably they were the real protagonists. And there's also a lot of discussion about who was accessing these legumes, because, you know, one think about the legumes as the meat of the poor. So the historians believe that if these people were eating legumes, that probably gives us an idea about the economic possibilities in a way, because of course if they had more resources, they were probably accessing more, let's say, tasteful or more the real meat, probably, rather than the real meat, animal products, let's say, or marine fish. So but there's so many different aspects that we need to consider altogether. So of course, economic possibilities. So again, this is a group of freedmen and freedwomen, most likely. And so, but they were probably also living in kind of a wealthy condition. This is our feeling. So
okay. That's lovely. Thank you. Thanks very much, Silvia, for that. Next one up, this probably certainly relates more to Tim. I'm going to take these two questions together. They may actually be from the same person. Somebody who is appearing on my screen as anonymous attendee, and I have no idea if it's the same anonymous attendee both times, asks firstly, so if they were baked, would that have been instantaneous death? And what was the average temperature of the pyroclastic flow stroke lava? Well, pyroclastic flow, we know. So can you come and give an answer to that, Tim?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And actually the second part of that, in terms of the temperature of the pyroclastic flow, is again an area which has been, and I'm going to use a terrible pun, hotly debated in terms of this context. So if we just think about that idea about that kind of instantaneous vaporization of soft tissue for a second, that Again, that doesn't happen. We know that that doesn't happen because there's all sorts of forensic casework to show that doesn't happen. Even at temperatures of up to 1,000 degrees, it still takes a period of time for the soft tissues to disappear. So this idea that there was this really hot pyroclastic flow coming down is not true. When we looked at the crystallinity index values of those individuals, they were coming in at a temperature, because our prediction equation for temperature is pretty solid, at temperatures of sort of 400-500 degrees, somewhere in that neck of the woods. When actually we look at other evidence from other studies of the town, again, and there's been studies that have looked at everything from the burnings of buildings to other objects, that's sort of in keeping with the idea about that temperature. So, I mean, I would think about that as a relatively low to middle temperature for a burning event. It seems quite high, but it's not in terms of the context of things that I work on. So it's not a huge temperature. So the pyroclastic flow wasn't as hot as you think it is. It's still hot enough to kill you, but it's not hot enough to do instantaneous damage. In terms of those individuals in the boathouses, again, because the temperature wasn't actually that hot, because again, they're inside these stone structures, so that it takes a while for the heat to dissipate through as well. No, this isn't an instantaneous death that we are thinking about. I mean, most likely what probably happened is that they got blocked in, there was suffocation, and then prolonged heating after the pyroclastic flow had covered those buildings.
Well, that's a nice grisly thought, isn't it? But, it is really interesting, though, that we can say that, that we can get that far.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to apologise in advance for probably mispronouncing this person's name. Cordula van Via, possibly, asks, firstly says, thank you for 2 wonderful talks, and then asks, is investigation of teeth a special field of inquiry? And what have you learned from the skeleton's teeth? Now, I know the answer to the first part of that is yes, so, but I'll throw it out in case one of you can tell us a little. Have we got anything that we can say from the skeleton's teeth?
Shall I answer that, Silvia, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there's nothing specifically done on the teeth of Herculaneum, but of course the teeth are very important for aging the skeleton. So all our knowledge about the age of each of the individuals comes mainly from their teeth, and from that we can then start to relate their age to their diet, which is very important. And we are seeing that change between the younger individuals and the older individuals, which suggests that there's maybe something happening in Roman society in the way that people are accessing food through life, which is quite a revelation, maybe telling us something about how food is being dispersed and how it's been the social organization. But the other thing that we're very interested in doing, and we've not tried this yet, but is actually trying to take the dental calculus. So this is the build-up of plaque that gets mineralized on ancient teeth. And then from that, we can actually start to probe into the proteins and DNA and learn something about the foods that they've been eating. More specifically, we get DNA sequences, but also something about their oral health as well. And I think that'll be a really interesting line of inquiry that we hope to pursue in the future.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Oliver. That's very helpful indeed. I'm trying to take these incoming questions in order. In fact, I'm not going to take the next one. I'm going to save that because that way we sort of carry on rather nicely. Sophia here asks, obviously different temperatures, as you mentioned, will have different effects on soft tissue. Was still with how you burn a body, Tim, I'm afraid. Is there a difference in how the skeletal material subjected to pyroclastic flow is analysed in comparison to cremation? And can this have an effect on the reliability or interpretation of data derived from the skeletal remains, such as stable isotope analysis, DNA, etc.? So I suppose really, are the two things directly comparable?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. They are directly comparable. I think that when we think about bone, although it undergoes quite a lot of change as a consequence of heat, that change is consistent. It doesn't matter what the heat source is. Perhaps the timings change a little bit, the subtleties of how that might work might change, but actually the bone will still undergo the same levels of change. So, we've done quite a bit of work on this because this is, to be honest, is the first kind of volcanic associated context in which we've attempted these methods on. So we have done quite a bit of work prior to this particular study to reassure ourselves that yes, we can compare the two things together. The only thing that we just need to be conscious of is perhaps the speed in which the body is in contact with the heat, as opposed to perhaps a pie where there may be a more regulated buildup of heat.
So broadly comparable.
Broadly comparable, yeah, absolutely.
That's good, thank you. Keith Adkins here asks now, not quite sure who this one's for really. Have you any evidence to tell if any of the dead were likely to have been slaves? And secondly, were you able to identify from the bones of teeth their geographical origins? I think we're getting into a slightly different area of isotopes here. So any takers on this one? Silvia?
Okay, I'll try to.
Okay.
So there's not certain evidence that some of these people were slaves, but again, there's that list of names that makes us believe that at least part of them were. We can see from the results from the stable isotopes that some of the individuals are getting very small quantities of animal products, and as I was saying, those were expensive items most likely. So that makes us reflect on the possibility that these individuals might have been less wealthy than some of the others. So yeah, I hope that answers. And as for the second one about the geographical origins, that's something else that we would really like to explore, and that's something that again can be done with teeth. So if we get access to the material again, and if the institutions are happy with us to do so, we would love to, because that would be really important, because it might be that these are a first generation of freedmen, or maybe they were freeborns from a previous generation of freedmen. So yeah, thank you for the question.
I was just going to add, Sylvia, because is it not the case that if there are so many freedmen within the population that's recorded in the album, the slaves' names wouldn't have been recorded, but it's likely, given the amount of freedmen, that there would be a lot of slaves within the Herculaneum society.
Yeah.
Historically, they're almost invisible. That's one of the problems, because they don't get recorded, the names don't get written down. But
yeah,
exactly.
And the other thing is, if their diets are, would they be distinguishable as slaves? Because if they're living in the homes and the houses, they're maybe getting similar foods to the actual occupants. And I think there was a case, wasn't it? One of the individuals, and this is not really reported in the literature, but it's kind of anecdotal, but there was a gold band on one of the ladies that was found within the assemblage. And everyone thought, well, this must be a high status person, until they saw an inscription on the inside that says, from my mistress, implying that actually this was given to them from.
I didn't know about this.
Yeah. So really, trying to tease apart who the slaves were is really difficult in the archaeological records, and it can be quite misleading based upon just looking at the kind of artifacts they're buried with or their diet.
Cool.
That's a lovely story, and a reminder that the position of slaves in Roman households was quite an interesting, quite complex one. There are two that I would like to get in still. We're watching the time running on. Again, this is an anonymous attendee asks, were there any odd or yet to be understood details about the specimens? Now, I realize this could occupy the rest of today, up till midnight at least, but any particularly odd or interesting little details about the specimens that you've studied so far?
The only thing that springs to mind for me, Sylvia, I don't know if you want to mention it, was there not one person was with a sheep? There was a manipulated sheep with them within the forest.
Yeah, we were discussing this a lot with Oliver. The archaeologists found some animal remains, and at the beginning they thought they were just dogs, but then we did another biological analysis, which is called zooms, which is basically, it's done on the collagen, and it allows you to identify the species. And we discovered that some of those dogs were actually sheep, and one of them was actually a cow, probably a little cow, because otherwise it wouldn't have been confused with a dog, I hope. But yeah, that's really curious, and it makes us believe again that probably, these people were probably kind of middle class, or they were probably living in close relation with these animals. They were relying a lot on these animal products, and we have been talking a lot about this, and we really don't know why this has never come up before. We should do something about it.
But in your final moments, you take some animals with you. rather than, I mean, I can understand it with your dog or your pet, but actually taking a sheep into the...
That's what makes me believe that they must have been really scared to lose their economic sustain. I think probably they were trying to save these animals as well. Like, okay, I have to save myself, but if I am without my sheep, how am I going to survive? Something like that. But that's me.
Well, yeah, sheep can be pets too. Let's be fair. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Right. This is the question I've been carrying over, and you'll see why I wanted to say this one. What are the requirements of your careers? Where would you recommend we pursue anthropology / archaeology? There you go. Quick answer from each of you in turn.
That's a good question. I mean, I'll start, and I think archaeology is a fantastic degree. I would say that I've come that way, but it encompasses the arts and the sciences. It goes all the way from prehistory to the contemporary. It's a massive range of things that you're able to study. Myself, I'm not an archaeologist. I was a biochemist who got interested in archaeology, hence this scientific research. But there's people working on the archaeology of space. There's people working on contemporary buildings. It's such a broad and interesting field and an area of inquiry. Where to study? Well, there's many great places. York being one of them, I would say.
I think I completely agree with that. It's the thing that makes me, makes it interesting for me is that variety of disciplines and those range of contexts. I did the slightly opposite to Ol. I studied archaeology as my undergraduate degree, and then took that that thinking and that approach and moved into the forensic context afterwards. And we don't do archaeology at Teesside, so go where you want.
Yeah, nothing to add really. I've done my degrees in Italy, and I come from a different background. It was sort of chemistry, but really I think I've been following some students here from the University of York, and they are great with their scientific background as well, and they are archaeologists. So really, yeah, I would go with archaeology and archaeological science then.
Thank you. That's not too obvious a plug for York, but obviously we're going to say that, aren't we? Yeah. Actually, one more just come up, which is very pertinent to what we've just been listening to. What factors control access to specimens? Does the lack of access or other factors restrict future careers? That's an interesting one. Any thoughts from any of the three of you?
I think just broadly, I mean, Oliver and Silvia might be able to talk more specifically about this context, but I think access to samples is a broad issue across all of archaeology, as it is, in the modern context as well. But for us, a collaborative approach where we're working with colleagues, and particularly in terms of the work that I do in that forensic context, which is about focuses a little bit more on capacity building and training and development and support. I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, and it's true, Silvia, isn't it? I mean, we've really worked closely with our colleagues at the park, the Herculaneum site, and also at the Pigorini Museum, which is the place where they've actually done the initial analysis of the skeletal remains. And it's kind of their efforts have been fundamental to allowing us to have access to the material to kind of go a little bit further with some of the scientific analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would like to add that nowadays, this kind of institutions such as Parco Herculaneum and Parco of Pompeii, they really care about also the type of analysis. So they really care about the analysis to be as less destructive as possible, which is also something we are going to we are trying to focus as a field that is growing and growing. So, for example, the analysis of amino acids is done on the collagen that was already extracted by Oliver's more than 10 years ago now, and I know that also what Tim you can tell, but I know that your type of analysis is also, we can say, it's microdestructive. It really needs a little material, and that can definitely make the access of the material much easier, because these institutions are not scared anymore.
Yeah. That's a very thorough answer. Thank you very much for all three. We've come to the end of the questions online, and to the end of an absolutely fascinating talk, I must say. 2 talks, 3 talks if we count the Q&A as well. It remains only for me to thank Silvia and Tim and all for a really enlightening hour or so. We know it's a glimpse, and the recording will be available on the Orchideas YouTube channel after the festival, so you can hear it all again and pick up the detail again for anything you missed or anything you want to rehear. And I think that's probably it. If you enjoyed this event, you may also be interested, incidentally, in the Rome is Burning one, which is coming up. Just check the details of that. Where are we? Yes, that's View Now Watch Again channel on YouTube. So if you go to festivalofideas.com, there's a lot of material coming up there. And as the festival goes on, more and more things will become available in retrospect. But even better, come along live as you have this afternoon and enjoy the talks absolutely firsthand. Thank you all for coming. We've had over 100 participants. Thank you very much to those of you who put up questions, and thank you very much to our speakers. I think we are done and look forward to the next one. Thank you.